Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and the fit for this video is the Spawn #1 cover. Let's take a look and see if needgod.net has debunked another Bible contradiction.
Number 2. How did Judas die? Matthew says that he returned the money he got for betraying Jesus and hung himself, while Acts said he acquired a field with the money and fell headlong and died. Again, this one doesn't contradict each other either. They line up.
So they do not line up. What this creator is arguing is that they can gin up scenarios in the background that are not in evidence that allow the specific details they are mentioning to all be true at the same time. The details that don't fit that ginned up scenario are simply omitted from the discussion.
After Judas regretted betraying Jesus, Judas returned the money to the chief priests, but they said it was blood money, so they couldn't put the money back into the treasury. So they decided to buy a field in Judas's name, and that's why it says Judas acquired a field, because it was bought in his name.
So there are 3 reasons that this explanation simply does not work, and the first has to do with the verb that occurs in Acts 1:18, which is kataome, which is not a reference specifically to purchasing or buying or to the transaction. It means to get, to gain, to obtain, to acquire. The verb actually refers to the act of coming into possession of something by whatever means: inheritance, purchase, conquest, being gifted something. The verb does not refer to the transactional act. It refers to gaining possession of something. And Judas never gained possession of the field if it was only purchased in his name after his death. The verb is simply not used that way, and this explanation simply falls to pieces in light of an adequate understanding of this verb and how it was used. This brings up the second problem, the notion that the chief priests would go and say, "Hi, we'd like to purchase this field in the name of our departed friend Judas, whom we paid so that we could have someone killed." That's not how things worked anciently. You didn't go buy things in the name of your criminal conspirator. That's asinine. And this brings up the third problem. This explanation entirely undermines the whole reason these 2 different accounts are different. They're providing different explanations of how the field came to be called Hakeldama, field of blood, and this creator entirely ignores that fact altogether. Why? Because the differences are irreconcilable. Acts says it became known as the field of blood because Judas's guts spilled out all over it. And that story began to spread, and so they called it the field of blood. According to the author of Matthew, it became known as Hakeldama, the field of blood, because they used blood money to purchase it. These 2 explanations of where that name came from are utterly irreconcilable. And that's why this creator just omits it from the discussion, because that does not fit. But when we try to stitch these together and gin up this imaginary scenario behind these 2 tellings of this story in a way that makes both tellings true, we undermine the points of the story. And Matthew's is very clearly altered in order to make it fit this prophecy about the 30 pieces of silver, because that's something that Matthew does in numerous places. Takes the tradition, tweaks it a little bit so it sounds like a more direct fulfillment of a prophecy that Matthew wants to show is fulfilled in Jesus. And so this explanation flatly fails to harmonize these 2 different accounts.
He then hung himself, and eventually the branch or rope snapped. Falling headlong just means he landed face down, causing the mess described in Acts chapter 1. So again, no contradiction there.
So again, this is ginning up a scenario that is not in evidence so that the dots of these 2 conflicting stories can be connected. And it does so in a way that undermines the author's own storytelling in each case. Because if this ginned up scenario is accurate, it means that the author of Acts is not there to tell us how Judas died. The author of Acts is there to tell us what happened after Judas was dead to his body, which means the focus is even more explicitly and emphatically on how the field came to be called the field of blood, The author is not saying anything about Judas's death. The author is saying, oh, by the way, Judas's dead body burst all over the field. That's why it's called the field of blood. Okay, so we're just skipping over how Judas died, and we're just talking about why this field is named the field of blood. Odd then that this creator would entirely omit the fact that this story would then entirely and exclusively be about the fact that it's called the field of blood because Judas's guts ended up all over it. Because in Matthew, it's called the field of blood for an entirely different reason. And so we're undermining both authors, who, by the way, are telling these stories in a way that resonate with certain stories from their scriptures. Acts is telling the story in a way that reflects the wisdom of Solomon, chapter 4, verses 17 through 19, where it talks about how the righteous dead will condemn the wicked living, and how God will throw them down face first on the ground. That is the passage that Acts has in mind in describing Judas supernaturally just dying and bursting open on the ground. That is the point of that story. In Matthew, the author is telling the story so as to fulfill this prophecy, but also wants the story to resonate with the Septuagint's version of 2 Samuel 17:21, which is the death of Ahithophel, who betrayed David. And then, after his plan failed, it says he went and hanged himself. And so Judas is represented as the betrayer of the Davidic ruler, the Davidic king, the Davidic Messiah. And so when your biggest concern when reading the Bible is how to make the stories all fit, you're prioritizing univocality, inerrancy, inspiration over and against what the stories themselves are saying. You're ignoring the ways the authors are crafting their stories. You're basically calling them liars, saying they're telling the story wrong, because they're ignoring the biggest details that you have had to gin up for the sake of making the stories agree. And it means you don't get to understand the text according to the ways the authors crafted them. All you're there to do is to assert that the texts have to agree, and it doesn't matter what the texts actually say.